May 26, 1908, 4 a.m. Masjid Soleiman, a desolate valley in southwestern Persia. British engineer George Reynolds was packing his bags. The operation was out of time. His boss, the British investor William Knox Darcy, had burned through his very last penny, drilling into this barren dirt, and was facing total bankruptcy. Then, a deep, muffled roar echoed from beneath the bedrock. A geyser of black liquid, heavy with the stench of sulfur, blasted 50 feet into the air. The Middle East's first commercial oil well had just erupted. The eruption of this well permanently altered the Strait of Hormuz. An ancient maritime tollbooth for spices and silk was transformed into the jugular vein of modern civilization. 7 years before the blowout in 1901, the ruler of Persia's Qajar dynasty, Muzaffar ad-Din Shah, ran out of cash. He needed to fund his court. He needed to fund his summer vacations in Europe. So, he signed the Darcy concession. For £20,000 in cash and a 16% share of future profits, the Shah handed the British exclusive oil rights to 1.2 million square kilometers of his country for 60 years. To a dictator, geography is not a sovereign asset. It is a personal ATM. But the decision that permanently locked the Strait of Hormuz into the center of global power didn't happen in the Middle East. It happened thousands of miles away in London. By 1913, with World War I looming, the British Royal Navy faced a strategic bottleneck. They possessed the largest fleet on Earth, safely powered by domestically mined Welsh coal. But the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, recognized a brutal physical reality. Oil burned hotter and faster. Switching the fleet from coal to oil would give British warships a decisive speed advantage over the Germans. So Churchill makes this massive gamble. To guarantee they never run out of this new fuel, the British government literally just buys the controlling stake in the Persian oil operation. They essentially create a corporate extension of their empire, which we now know as BP. From that moment on, the nature of the Strait of Hormuz fundamentally changed. It was no longer just a dispensable trade route, it became the physical bloodline of the British Empire. Without the oil flowing through this narrow channel, the most powerful armada in the world would be reduced to floating scrap metal. To protect this fragile lifeline, the British required absolute stability in the Persian Gulf. And for an empire, the cheapest way to buy stability is to prop up a strongman. In the 1920s, with British backing, a Cossack cavalry commander named Reza Khan launched a coup, overthrew the decaying Qajar dynasty, and established the Pahlavi dynasty. This new regime ruled with an iron fist, fueled by a deeply flawed economic engine known in political economy as the Rentier State Curse. In any normal system, a government that relies on domestic taxation to survive, whether a democracy or a traditional dictatorship, is forced into a social contract. Democracies exchange taxes for political representation. Even traditional dictators must make certain economic compromises with the public, because the citizens ultimately hold the nation's purse strings. But the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz completely shattered this basic law of governance. The Shah did not need the productivity of his people, nor did he need to collect a single dime in taxes. He only needed his army to guard the oil wells and ensure the crude flowed west. Foreign capital bypassed the domestic economy entirely, depositing directly into royal accounts. When an autocrat achieves absolute financial independence from his own citizens, the people lose all political leverage. They are no longer the creators of national wealth. Instead, they are merely a potential threat to the dictator's monopoly on the pie.
In 1951, this distorted system temporarily fractured. The Iranian people experienced a moment that brought them closer to true democracy than ever before in their modern history. Mohammad Mossadegh was democratically elected as prime minister. His mandate was simple: take the oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz out of British control and return the wealth to the Iranian state. He announced the total nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This move did not just challenge a corporate monopoly, it directly threatened the energy security of the West. and the absolute power of the domestic monarchy. The response was purely transactional and brutally efficient. In 1953, orchestrated by Britain's MI6 and executed by the American CIA, a coup codenamed Operation Ajax overthrew Mossadegh's legitimate government. The young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was reinstalled on the throne in Tehran with absolute executive power, completely backed by Western intelligence. To ensure the oil kept flowing west, the brief window of Iranian democracy was simply discarded. By this point, the Strait of Hormuz had completed a terrifyingly dark loop of power. Oil flowed out through the strait to the west, fueling the massive economic boom of the post-World War II capitalist world. And the dollars paid by the West flowed back through that very same strait into Tehran, transforming into the most advanced American fighter jets in the Shah's arsenal, and funding SAVAK, the brutal secret police force that terrified every Iranian. The Strait of Hormuz, once a bustling trade corridor, had officially become the perfect umbilical cord, a pipeline for the authoritarian regime to siphon global wealth, only to weaponize it and brutally suppress its own people. And this was just the beginning of a half-century-long game of global extortion. Reinstalled on the throne, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi learned a cold lesson. Absolute power requires absolute control. Any remaining demand for democracy was systematically erased. By the early 1970s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had completely consolidated his absolute grip on power. He controlled the state, and the state controlled the strait. For an autocrat sitting on the world's most critical energy chokepoint, the timing of this political monopoly was flawless. Then came 1973. The global oil crisis quadrupled the price of crude. Almost overnight, an unprecedented tsunami of wealth flooded through the strait and directly into the Shah's control. With this infinite checkbook, the dictator set out to artificially purchase a modern empire. In the mid-1970s, Tehran draped itself in the dazzling illusion of a modern, secular utopia. The city streets were lined with bustling cafes, neon-lit cinemas, and chic boutiques. Young people, in the latest Western fashion, walked along newly paved boulevards, while a rapidly expanding skyline of glass and concrete surged from the desert. But a state's underlying reality is never defined by its aesthetics. It is defined by its financial plumbing. And the singular artery funding this entire modernization spectacle was the Strait of Hormuz. The geographic tollbooth at the Strait of Hormuz began generating wealth at an unprecedented scale. The Shah's annual oil revenues skyrocketed from less than $1 billion to nearly $20 billion. When a regime acquires infinite capital that is completely decoupled from the productivity of its citizens, the result is unchecked structural extravagance. The wealth of the strait funded the most expensive party in modern history. At the ruins of Persepolis, celebrating 2,500 years of the Persian Empire, the Shah flew in 18 tons of gourmet food, baccarat crystal, and roasted peacocks directly from Paris. Flush with petrodollars, he sat in his opulent palaces, lecturing Western leaders on television about how to manage their economies. But this prosperity was strictly isolated. While the Shah and a tiny elite circle, the so-called 1,000 families, hoarded the oil revenues, the slums of South Tehran were rapidly expanding. Just a few miles away from the royal palaces, millions of rural farmers, displaced by the regime's top-down economic reforms, poured into the capital. They found no infrastructure and no jobs. They built shanty towns. They lived without electricity, without basic sanitation, and without running water. The capital flowing through the Strait of Hormuz wasn't building a modern nation. It was building an impenetrable wall between the 0.1% and everyone else. Absolute wealth requires absolute security. The billions of petrodollars didn't build a resilient society. They built a gilded pressure cooker. By the 1970s, the Shah's secret police, SAVAK, had metastasized into an industrial-scale apparatus of state terror. The regime offered a highly specific transactional freedom. Citizens could wear miniskirts, consume Western media, and drink imported liquor. But the moment the conversation turned to politics, labor rights, or the wealth of the strait, the state responded with forced disappearances. Savak infiltrated universities, factories, and newsrooms. Operating with complete impunity, they didn't merely target violent insurgents. They systematically eradicated Iran's entire secular, moderate, and left-leaning intellectual class. Writers, professors, and democratic reformers were physically removed from the political equation in the interrogation rooms of Evin prison. The Shah had successfully sterilized the political landscape of his country. But this political sterilization contained a fatal structural flaw. By violently eradicating every secular and moderate opposition group, the Shah left exactly one organized network intact: the mosques. It was the single institution he could not dismantle without triggering a holy war. When extreme wealth inequality, systemic corruption, and state violence finally pushed the population past its breaking point, the clerics were the only group left with the infrastructure to organize dissent. They were the only ones left with a microphone. In 1979, the pressure cooker detonated. The revolution that toppled the Shah was not initially a purely religious movement. It was a mass mobilization of pure rage against a corrupt, oil-funded autocracy. The Shah fled, the monarchy collapsed, and the world watched as Ayatollah Khomeini established the Islamic Republic. As the dust settled over Tehran, the geographic tollbooth at the Strait of Hormuz was still printing billions. The question was no longer about the survival of the monarchy, but about the mechanism of the state. Would the new theocratic government distribute the astronomical oil wealth to the impoverished citizens who fueled the revolution? Would they dismantle the terrifying infrastructure of state repression? Or would the new rulers look at the strait, recognize the infinite political power it provided, and discover a temptation far too dark to resist? The revolution succeeded, but the underlying economic reality of the state remained identical. The endless oil profits flowing through the Strait of Hormuz were not redistributed to the ordinary citizens who had bled in the streets. Instead, the wealth was seamlessly absorbed by a newly established, even larger and more meticulous machine: the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. To consolidate the new theocracy and suppress internal and external threats, the IRGC required astronomical funding. And the ultimate source of that capital remained that 2-mile-wide geographic tollbooth. The old ruling class had been purged, but the gears of the Rentier State simply swapped operators and kept turning. Within months, this wealth, along with the lives of countless civilians, would be entirely consumed by a conventional war.
In September 1980, the neighboring Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, taking advantage of Iran's post-revolution internal chaos, ordered his army across the border. One of the longest and bloodiest conventional wars of the 20th century, the Iran-Iraq War, exploded into existence. This began as a terrestrial war over territory and ideology. Along a 1,000-mile border, both sides locked into a meat grinder reminiscent of World War I. Trench warfare, chemical gas attacks, and tens of thousands of young men sent to the front lines as cannon fodder. War is incredibly expensive. To sustain this massive killing machine, both Saddam and Khomeini were burning through cash at a terrifying rate. And their only way to make money was exporting oil. Inevitably, the flames of war spread to the sea. In 1984, aiming to economically suffocate Iran, the Iraqi Air Force began bombing Iran's primary oil export terminals and oil tankers. Iran was pushed into a corner. Due to Western arms embargoes, their air force was severely lacking spare parts, leaving them completely incapable of flying across the Gulf to bomb Iraq's oil infrastructure. Since they couldn't hit Iraq, the IRGC made a decision that shocked the world. They turned their crosshairs on completely neutral, third-party commercial ships. This was the tanker war. Because Arab states like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia were financially backing Saddam, the IRGC decided that any vessel carrying their oil was a legitimate target. They began deploying sea mines on a massive scale in and around the Strait of Hormuz. IRGC speedboats, armed with RPGs and heavy machine guns, indiscriminately attacked civilian oil tankers from Japan, Norway, Liberia, and beyond. During this tanker war, over 400 civilian merchant ships were attacked, and hundreds of unarmed civilian sailors were killed. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had inadvertently discovered a devastatingly effective asymmetric tactic. They didn't need a world-class conventional navy. They just needed to drop a few mines in the Strait of Hormuz and blow up a few commercial ships to throw the global oil market into a panic, forcing the whole world to pay for their regime. A brand new asymmetric game was beginning to take shape in these waters. April 14, 1988, 4:50 p.m. The waters in the central Persian Gulf were unusually calm. The United States Navy guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts was executing a mission to escort Kuwaiti oil tankers. Suddenly, a muffled boom echoed from beneath the surface. A 250-pound Iranian M08 naval mine detonated directly beneath the ship's keel. The sheer force of the explosion ripped a 15-foot hole in the hull. Toxic smoke and seawater instantly flooded the engine room, completely knocking out the main generators. A massive pillar of fire shot into the sky. This was the absolute breaking point, where the previously mentioned tanker war spiraled completely out of control. In an attempt to cut off their adversary's economic lifeline, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had secretly laid hundreds of sea mines in and around the Strait of Hormuz. For third-party commercial ships passing through at the time, these waters became a literal death trap. Unarmed oil tankers and desperate civilian sailors constantly faced two nightmares: either having their keels snapped by untraceable underwater mines, or facing indiscriminate machine gun fire from IRGC speedboats. The IRGC attempted to use this tactic, expressly targeting civilian merchant ships to force the world into submission through fear. But this completely shattered the bottom line of the international community at the time. Faced with this direct threat to the lifeline of global shipping and civilian lives, the United States stepped up to call for joint international intervention and received a highly positive response. Washington was not fighting alone. The British Royal Navy immediately deployed Hunt-class minesweepers. France sent a task force led by an aircraft carrier. Soon after, warships from Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands also sailed into the Persian Gulf. These nations formed a massive coalition fleet in the Strait of Hormuz. The Americans provided the escort in the front, while their European allies swept for mines on the flanks.
Just 4 days after the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck the mine, the United States, backed by the international community, decided to strike back. On the morning of April 18, 1988, the US military launched Operation Praying Mantis, the largest surface naval engagement since World War II. US Marines fast-roped from helicopters to directly assault and destroy the armed maritime platforms the IRGC used to coordinate attacks on merchant ships. The Iranian Navy was forced to leave port and engage. At 1 p.m., the Iranian frigate Sahand spotted the USA-6 attack aircraft overhead and fired the first anti-aircraft missile. It would be the last move it ever made on the water. The US warplanes swiftly retaliated. 2 Harpoon anti-ship missiles and multiple laser-guided bombs slammed with pinpoint accuracy onto the deck of the Sahand. The flagship instantly turned into a massive fireball. Its ammunition magazines detonated, and it sank to the bottom of the sea just hours later. Another Iranian frigate that came to assist was also completely crippled by a precisely dropped US laser-guided bomb. In less than 12 hours, the US military directly destroyed half of Iran's operational naval fleet. This disastrous defeat left the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps with a profound lesson. They realized that building large warships to fight a conventional positional war with the Americans in the Persian Gulf was suicide. Consequently, the IRGC's tactics underwent a complete transformation. They abandoned the development of a regular navy, opting instead to build a mosquito fleet that would become a headache for the entire world. Since they couldn't build a large ship capable of rivaling a destroyer, they would build thousands of speedboats packed with explosives. The IRGC began stockpiling massive amounts of anti-ship missiles, sea mines, and suicide drones in the concealed terrain along both shores of the Strait of Hormuz. Their logic was crystal clear. They didn't need to defeat the US Navy. They only needed to use these incredibly cheap speedboats to create endless, daily friction in the strait. As long as they could threaten passing oil tankers at any moment and send global crude freight rates soaring, they held the chips to extort the world. This tactic has persisted to this very day. Today's US military operates fleets of stealth F-35 fighter jets, possessing a precision strike capability dozens, if not hundreds, of times stronger than in 1988. In a very short period of time, US forces drove straight into the Venezuelan capital of Caracas, captured Nicolas Maduro, and brought him to the US to face trial. And just recently, they executed a decapitation strike against Iran's supreme leader with terrifying precision. These surgical military operations would have been completely unimaginable back in 1988. For today's US military, physically retaking control of the Strait of Hormuz and obliterating those surrounding speedboats and missile sites poses absolutely no tactical difficulty. And yet, a bizarre phenomenon has emerged. Today, as the United States once again faces a crisis in the Strait, and even as the White House announces a total blockade of Hormuz, if we look back, the British, French, and Italian minesweepers and destroyers that closely followed and fought alongside America back then are nowhere to be found. Faced with the United States at the unprecedented peak of its military power, its allies have refused to board the ship. Are they afraid they can't defeat the IRGC's armed speedboats? Absolutely not. This can only point to one conclusion. Inside this seemingly invincible military machine, something far more core to its existence than aircraft carriers and stealth fighters has been completely shattered over the past few years.
Behind the current naval standoff in the Strait of Hormuz lies a mathematical formula of imperial hegemony. Historically, the American formula for maintaining global commercial order was structural and precise. The United States provided 60% of the hard power, which, when combined with 40% moral authority and an extensive alliance network, produced 100% absolute deterrence. In popular discourse, moral responsibility often sounds like a naive academic buzzword. But in the cold reality of international geopolitics, it is the ultimate form of pragmatism. It is the cheapest available lubricant for a superpower to manage the globe. Precisely because a hegemon commits to protecting freedom of navigation and defending civilian merchant ships, nations like Britain, France, Germany, and Japan become willing to share the military burden and integrate their fleets under a unified command. But in recent years, an extreme unilateralism, often characterized as a Jacksonian foreign policy, voluntarily dismantled this formula. Washington began reducing global affairs to naked, zero-sum transactions. The administration publicly humiliated Allied leadership, threatened to sever defense funding to Europe, and weaponized tariffs against traditional partners. It floated imperially arrogant concepts like purchasing Greenland and adopted a strictly cold, transactional posture toward core Indo-Pacific allies like Japan and Taiwan. When a superpower treats the strategic interests of its allies as dispensable, its hard power may indeed continue to grow, perhaps increasing from 60 to 65%. However, the 40% that originally stemmed from alliances and moral authority simply drops to zero. Consequently, when Washington now attempts to dictate terms in the Strait of Hormuz or threatens a total blockade, it looks over its shoulder and finds itself structurally isolated. Not a single allied nation is willing to risk its own assets for a purely self-serving hegemony. This creates a fatal paradox. How can Washington's hard power increase, yet leave it appearing so paralyzed in this naval standoff? The answer lies in the machinery of the American state. Unlike an autocracy, it cannot govern globally through pure hard power alone. Internationally, it has forfeited the leverage of moral authority and alliances. Domestically, it remains bound to public opinion and the ballot box. And this places Washington perfectly into the Iranian regime's ultimate asymmetric trap, the asymmetry of pain. In this 2-mile-wide chokepoint, victory is no longer determined by the range of a nation's missiles, but by which system can endure more economic and political pain. American politicians are beholden to the electoral cycle. If conflict ignites in the Strait, global oil prices will spike. The resulting domestic inflation and soaring gas prices would instantly obliterate the ruling party in the upcoming elections. The American political system is fundamentally terrified of subjecting its voters to economic shock. The autocrats across the Strait, however, are insulated from public opinion. The regime in Tehran is indifferent if domestic inflation hits 50 or 100%. They are unbothered if ordinary citizens lose everything to sanctions. As long as they control the military, the speedboats, and the ability to instantly sever 20% of the global energy supply, they are perfectly willing to weaponize the suffering of their own people to hold the electoral systems of the Western world hostage. This is the ultimate absurdity we are witnessing in the Strait of Hormuz today. On one side, the largest, most sophisticated war machine in human history. On the other, a cornered regime with a shattered economy, barely surviving by cannibalizing its own nation's future. When a superpower arrogantly discards the lubricant of moral authority, attempting to maintain its hegemony, relying solely on physical intimidation, it suddenly realizes a hard truth. Even with the firepower to destroy the Earth 10 times over, it cannot, on its own, completely subdue a geographic chokepoint just 2 miles wide. That concludes the strategy session. If you found value in this analysis, please like, subscribe, and share to support the mission. Meeting adjourned.